You heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect?
I've heard of it, but no, go.
Dunning-Kruger effect is a psychological theory that talks about your competence versus your confidence, basically. It's a competent confidence graph.
Right.
Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of Paddle and Flow. This is just a quick introduction to the episode, as this is a part 2 of the previous episode. We're going to talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect, but we're also going to talk about how we learn in our comfort, stretch and panic zones. Now this episode turns into a bit of a ramble, so I apologise about that. If you do find this interesting and you want us to return to it with a bit more structure, let us know in the comments, because I'm really passionate about this sort of stuff. This is one of the things that gets me really excited, as you'll be able to tell from this episode. But because we weren't necessarily prepared to have the conversation, it's not following a normal structure. Hopefully you find it interesting. Do give it a watch, give it a like. If you're listening on Spotify or Amazon, do leave us a comment, and thank you very much for getting involved. As always, we really appreciate the support, and we hope you enjoy this episode. Take care. Now, for me to draw the graph or describe it on a podcast is going to be difficult. Basically, I'll go through it, but I'll not describe what it looks like. I'll go through the individual components of it. So when you start a new activity, you will often find people whose confidence is high, but their competence is low. And they call it Mount Stupid. So if you think about a graph, right, you get an initial up spike. And unlike Nicola spiker, which is quite wide, this spike is often short-lived. So you go up this steep curve where you have a lot of confidence, but not very much competence. So you're not necessarily very good at the thing that you're doing. But you have a lot of confidence because you don't know what you don't know. Because you don't know what you don't know, you think you know everything.
Is there a difference in the genders with this as well?
That's a very good question, but I don't have an answer to that. I have never read anything that differentiates it from gender, because a lot of what I read, I've read it in many different theories. I've read it for poker. I've read it for coaching sport. I've read it for medical, sort of emergency medical scenarios, and sort of when doing a lot of emergency medical education, we talk about it a lot. Like, I read it in so many different fields, but I've never heard about it, different genders.
Right.
Possibly.
That'd be interesting to know. Yeah.
We can look that up. If you know, leave a comment below. Does the Dunning-Kruger effect have a gender difference, bias?
Yeah.
But basically, you have this big spike in confidence, and you don't know what you don't know. And if you think about like that day that I talked about on the podcast a few weeks ago, where Russell and I went out and we had that snowstorm, that's probably a really good example of being at the peak of Mount Stupid. That's probably a really good example of that, because we hadn't risk assessed the conditions going forwards. We hadn't looked ahead, so we were confident in the conditions that we were in, but then the conditions changed, and actually all of a sudden we found ourselves crashing into the Valley of Despair, which is the next section.
Oh.
Where your competence increases. So you become better, you become more knowledgeable or more skilled at the thing, and all of a sudden you go, I know what I don't know, and all of a sudden your confidence drops. You have this sudden crashing of confidence because you know what you don't know, and you are afraid of it. You are afraid of what you don't know. So sometimes when we think about risk and we think about going out on the sea, is a really good example of this. Sometimes you'll say, oh, actually, I'm going to stay on land because I know that I lack the knowledge in that bracing technique. When we were in the water, when we were out on that day that you and I have been talking about today, that we were in that peaked waves, there was a short period, I was sliding down one side, you were having a great time, although a bit worried about me. I knew that I did not know how to roll. I know that I can't roll. And the video that I made a few weeks ago of me getting very cold and wet proves that I know that I don't know how to roll. But I do know how to brace. I do know how to do sort of a low brace. So I can stop myself needing to roll. But once I was upside down, I wouldn't have been able to deal with that. So that was adding to my discomfort, because I knew that if I did swim, if it was going to be a wet exit from my kayak, I knew you'd like that one, that you were going to have to help me to get back in my boat. Now I know how to get back into my boat. I know how to self-rescue. If I've got someone else to sort of support the boat, if we can, paddles across the boat and stabilize my boat, I know I can get back in it. In flat water.
Yeah, I wouldn't have gone for it in those waves. Would have, had to.
You've had to have swum in a bit and
Yeah.
So, that's why, and one of the reasons I was so uncomfortable, because I was in, when I think about sit-in kayaking specifically, I am in that valley of despair. And then that kind of tails off and you end up with a sort of mid-confidence to competence, and it kind of just steadily increases the graph. The way the Dunning-Kruger effect graph works, it just kind of steadily increases, and then you start to know what you don't know. And when you know what you don't know, you can improve because you can start working on it, and then you know what you know and you know what you don't know. And it's brilliant theory. Applies to paddling. But so I would have said, listening to what you said about Mikko Spiker, that you now know that that gap may have a risk, but you're quite happy to potentially go through it. But you might not, because you're worried about that happening again.
Yeah.
But you know how to deal with it if it does happen, and you have dealt with it.
Yeah. Yes, and yes. But it is very interesting. Yeah, that valley of despair I can recognize that in other areas of my life. We come back to this off camera. Yeah.
I think it's the most powerful thing in learning a new skill for me, as someone who learns a lot of new skills. I love learning, I really enjoy learning, is to get yourself into the valley of despair as quickly as possible.
Really? That's a good place to be?
It's a hard place to be. It's not an easy place to be. Psychologically and mentally, it is a difficult place to be in. But if you can get yourself in it, you can get yourself out of it. And when you get yourself out of it, that's when the real learning, that's when you really start learning. Like, your learning of a new skill massively increases following that. And I can't really use kayaking as an example anymore, because it's too, I'm through the valley of despair and I'm on the other side of it. But because I do so many different types of kayaking and I'm learning lots of different types, it's trying to work out. I can't do the Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm so hyper aware of the Dunning-Kruger effect that I try and avoid Mount Stupid at all costs. Although I have definitely been there.
Very wise. Yeah.
And I've been there in many different aspects of my life. If I think about photography, if I go for photography as a skill that I'm really working on at the moment, I am. In fact, no. Let's do videography. Let's think about my YouTube channel. Okay. My YouTube channel has a great trajectory of the Dunning-Kruger effect, because there are some videos on my channel that I thought were quite good that are awful.
Oh, really?
Yes. And there are some videos that I produced recently that I know are bad, but I knew they were bad when I put them out. I put them out because the algorithm mandated it.
Right.
Because I felt like I needed to get them out, and I didn't have time in my life to make them any better. Now that's different to not, but I know that they're not good enough, really. Mm-hmm. They're not the quality that I want. The fact that I made a decision based on that is null and void. I knew that they weren't good enough. And that's the difference. It's the difference between knowing that something is good or not good and not knowing. So I think it's really important. The quicker you can get yourself through into the valley of despair, and out the other side, so you know what you don't know. Because as soon as you know what you don't know, you can start learning. And you can start fixing the things you don't know.
And is there an issue with motivation? Yeah. Like, does that come into it?
Not in the Dunning-Kruger effect, not in the theory of the Dunning-Kruger effect. Right. Motivation is probably something else, and how you motivate yourself around that is well, there will be a theory on it. I don't know what it is. But what motivates, and that's individual. So then we come into I love this podcast today. We're having a great time. Then we come into intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So we can talk about that a little bit. So for me, when I hit that, I don't know, I know what I don't know, I don't like being there.
Yes.
It does not make me happy. I don't like the fact I know I'm not good at it. I don't like the fact that I know what to... sometimes I know I don't know what to do about it. Sometimes that's the problem. I know that I don't know how to get better at this thing. And that's where I get really motivated. That really motivates me to find the answer.
And I think I've seen a lot of paddlers reach that point and they don't have that motivation. They just stop. Can't do it. Give up.
It's when most people are likely to give up a new skill. That is a documented. I don't know if I can tell you who did the paper on it, but there is a paper on it, and if there's not, I should bloody go and write one. There is a paper on, I'm sure there is, the fact that is when people are most likely to give up because they realise that they aren't good at it. And coaching kids through sport, I have seen kids give up when they've hit that point.
Yeah.
And I've seen adults give up. I've seen people give up jobs. I've seen students leave university courses because they've hit that point and they haven't known how to progress through it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe don't have the support. Well, no, I'm just thinking
Could
of it.
be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could be all sorts of reasons.
Could be support. Could be. So this is where we talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
As I stressed on. So for me, that really motivates me. Like that's what gets me fired up. I want to go and be good at something, knowing what I don't know and trying to find the answers is what drives me.
Right.
What I find difficult is when I know that I don't know where to get that information. That's when I start to struggle.
Right.
Because I don't know how to get past it. And that's where I struggle. That's intrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is where we're motivated by the number of likes we get on social media, the number of views this video gets, the number of views this podcast gets, the negative comments on social media. You said at the end of our last video, which I think I've left in, no negative comments.
Negative comments?
That's your extrinsic motivation. So if you're motivated by, so there's a lot of study out there. Carol Dweck is a brilliant author on this sort of thing. She's looked at education in kids up to 16, 17 years old, and then what happens in their adult life following their education at childhood, and how gold stars are a brilliant example of extrinsic motivation. You've done well, here's a gold star. That makes sense?
It does make sense.
So then when you don't get that gold star when you've done well, you don't know if you have done well or haven't done well. So if you think about taking up a new skill and motivating yourself to get through that point, if you're doing it so that someone else says, well done, you've done well, or you're doing it so you can put a photo up on Facebook and get a load of likes, that is your extrinsic motivation. But if you don't have that, if you don't have that support then that's what the support, that sometimes support is actually you've done a really good job there. Mm-hmm. And that encourages people to keep going.
We are wandering.
We are wandering well away from paddling.
And into all sorts of rabbit holes and along all sorts of winding.
And I genuinely think this is my favourite. I can't believe we're talking. It's actually not. It was not an intention at all to talk about this. We were talking about risk and we were talking about risk assessment, but maybe this is inherent in your ability to understand the risk that you take when you're out on the water.
It's relevant. It's certainly relevant to paddling because when you start kayaking, the biggest, not mistake, but the biggest issue people have is going around in circles.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that has put people off.
Yeah, definitely.
And they just stop. Yeah.
Doing a new degree at the moment, and the thing I'm finding difficult is I'm trying to not be at Mount Stupid. Because obviously I used to be, how do I word this without giving away too much of our personal lives on social media, which will probably come out at some point, like 10 years down the line if this podcast keeps going, but maybe not today. I used to deliver education at a similar, although not the same level, as education that I'm currently receiving. So it's very difficult for me to sit there and go, oh yeah, I know all this. Actually, do I know it all? Do I know it all at the level I need to know it at? Because I was immersed in it for 4 years and I was doing it every single day for 4 years. But was I doing it at that level? Do I actually know it? Do I not know it?
Yeah.
And I'm finding it really difficult. I haven't hit the valley of despair yet. I probably will at some point. I've got some placements coming up. That'll probably put me there. Really put it into the test. But it's interesting, isn't it?
It is, very. We could have a whole series of podcasts just on this.
I love it. I could so do a podcast on this. I thought about doing a podcast on leadership, but I didn't have anyone else to talk to, so I would have just been me rambling by myself.
Well, leadership in paddle sport.
Yeah, we can do that. We'll do that episode down the line, and we can interview Russell.
Which one?
Hence,
sorry, but there are. Sorry. No, well, two.
There are. 'Cause, well, we could do both of them together.
Yes, actually.
Well, they're both there.
Yeah. But I'm still learning with this whole sea kayaking thing, because you don't just go for a paddle, you go for a pure paddle.
Mm-hmm.
And is there leadership there? Is there not? Yeah. So that's a whole, there's so many things we could ramble on about for hours.
If we're going to talk about leadership, we have to talk about the documentary I watched recently about Greenpeace. And there was a huge leadership disaster in the middle of the documentary. There's a huge leadership failing.
Oh, really?
And oh my God, you could sit and talk about it for hours. I think it's so interesting. In fact, I probably do need to look at it properly and analyze it properly, because it's really, really interesting. Can talk about it when we're out in the water. Can talk about, even just you and I going for a paddle together. What's the leadership? Is there leadership? What's the mentoring?
Is that ever going to happen again? That's the biggest question.
Not in the current weather.
No.
So we've gone on a bit of a ramble, and a lot of this some of this will have got cut out. Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in the future, and we're going to expand more on. But we've talked about risk. We've had a really good discussion about risk. Did we ever finish the question before I went on my Dunning-Kruger effect rank? Did we ever finish the question? Do you have to be a risky paddler to be a good paddler, or are you a good paddler because you have the ability to manage the risks?
I think we both think the same thing on that one.
Which is that you are a good paddler because you have the ability to manage the risk.
Which for me comes down to, if I thought there was going to be any risk of me not coming back, I wouldn't go out.
Yeah.
And that comes on to the we're all between swims as well. Another phrase I don't like. we do have to have a podcast, phrases that Nicola doesn't like.
Yeah, we will do. That'll be the next one. That's probably going to be the next one.
Old and grumpy.
I think you have to put yourself in risky situations to improve. I think there are situations where you have to test yourself in those situations. That's what we haven't touched on. So when the example is you and I out on that paddle where we were in those steep waves. I, having been exposed to that situation, although I had the ability to deal with it, although I felt like I maybe didn't have the ability to deal with it, I know that I did. But now I know that I could go in that situation again and I wouldn't have the fear, and I would be more confident, which inherently makes it less risky.
So that was a positive for you, whereas my experience is possibly a bit of a negative. Because even though I did handle it and did manage it, I'm less likely to do it again.
It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because then, so I think you do need to be exposed to situations that challenge you, because that's how we improve, but not situations that challenge you beyond a point that you're able to deal with it.
Yeah.
And that theory is called...
Oh, there's another one.
There is another one. But we'll maybe hold that for another podcast. Well, it does kind of round this off quite nicely. Maybe not.
I have to see what it was called, at least.
I can't remember it. That's why I interrupted myself. It's called the panic stretch zone. Now, who initially that's attributed to, I don't know off the top of my head. I have, to my right here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 books that probably all have the theory in it, which if I just opened one of them, I could probably find it.
Or Google.
And Google it, but I'm not going to. Instead, I'm just going to go with, it's called the panic stretch theory. And there's lots of, like I said, there's lots of different versions of it. But in your safe zone, when you are comfortable and safe in a warm blanket, being hugged, and you're nice and safe and cozy, you're probably not testing your skills because you're nice and safe and cozy.
But it's safe and cozy.
And it's enjoyable.
Yeah.
And it's often enjoyable.
Yeah.
But it's safe and cozy. When you start to stretch yourself and put yourself in situations where you need to be thinking a bit more and developing, using those skills, getting that, tactile motion, building those muscle memories, doing the things that you need to do, you become better because you'll become more accustomed to doing those things. You can do them faster. You don't need to think. You said a brilliant line for this, which was, you didn't think your ear touched the water, you started to get wet, and you instinctively just braced and deep water rescued yourself, and just straight up, quick stroke, and you were up. As a brilliant example of having a muscle memory, having a system 1 thought process to deal with a situation that was developing, because you'd probably practiced it in your stretch zone how many times when you were whitewater paddling, when you were
Yeah.
slalom kayaking, when you were, how many times you actually practiced that skill versus if I tried to do that and I'd have to really think, oh, and that's going to put more pressure on me to perform it.
It wasn't always there. It didn't always work. I have swum.
Yeah, absolutely. And you will, because that's how you learn. But by doing that, you put yourself in your stretch zone and you learn. If you push yourself too far and you go out in situations that are too stressful or the environment is so far beyond what you're capable of doing, you enter your panic zone. And when you're in your panic zone, you are quite literally in your brain's fight or flight mode. Adrenaline will be pumping, you've got cortisol running around your body. You aren't going to learn from that event because your body will do everything to get you safe, whatever that means. But your body will have so many chemicals running around the body that you won't actually be able to develop from that point.
That's interesting.
So if you think about, if I use the example of you paddling in the big sea around the harbour where you were thinking about pulling your PLB.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that too.
Until we've broken it down in the podcast, had you thought about it before then?
Thought about what?
That experience.
Yes. Yeah, a lot.
A lot.
I think I did learn something from it, that I could do it. But would I want to repeat it again? Like, is it something I think, I can do that, I'll do that again? No, thank you.
That's really interesting. So I would argue you were right on the limit of your stretch zone, probably. You probably weren't in your panic zone. You were probably right on the very edge of stretch, right at the far reaches of it, touching the panic, probably into panic and out of it, probably floating between the two. Because you got back on land, you reflected on it, and maybe that's just a commentary on who you are as a person and how you learn and develop, is you reflect on what you've done.
The key thing about that experience, I can just close my eyes and I'm back there, is that it was perfectly within my ability. It was perfectly within the boat's ability. It just was not what I wanted. I wanted to be wrapped in my blanket, and I would have done anything to have been wrapped in my blanket than be out there. Was I on the cusp of panic? I was keeping that under control because panicking would have been pulling the PLB.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Is that what? Is it?
Yeah.
Is it
So
that
panic. When it
clear
talks
cut?
about panic zone, it doesn't necessarily mean panic as a psychological state.
Right.
It means there's another word for it. There's a burnout. They call it burnout zone. They call it. There's lots of different names for that area. But the idea is once you enter that psychological state, you're not developing. You can't learn. So we've gone off on a bit of a tangent today.
But an interesting tangent, and that valley of despair.
The valley of despair.
That's exactly where I am.
Yeah, and that's kind of, this is where I get really excited about learning and skills and skill development, and this is what really, as you can tell,
No.
it's what really gets me going. Thinking about how we learn and develop, and as you say, when you're in that zone, it does sound like you're at the very edge of your stretch zone. And I actually don't think I've been out kayaking, like even when I was with Russell and it was snowstorm coming in, I was probably on the very edge of my panic zone where I was under pressure and I was worried.
Yeah.
And I was starting to get to the stage where actually, I wasn't going to be able to keep going at that pace, but I was probably only just in it. And looking back on it, I learned a lot from it, but I wasn't overwhelmed. I didn't become frozen. I didn't. When people enter the panic zone, they freeze.
Right. Okay.
She's going to hate me for telling this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. I told you about my wife skiing and how I fell out with her.
Yes.
Last week when we were walking down St. Anne's.
Yes.
So the story goes for the podcast. We're out skiing. My wife is not a very experienced skier, I think it's fair to say. She'd had maybe 6 weeks of lessons, so 6 hours, or maybe 12 hours, 2-hour lessons, of lessons on a dry ski slope. And we'd gone skiing, and unfortunately, due to an administrative problem, the lessons were cancelled. Basically, I think the instructor had fallen and broken their leg, so they weren't going to be able to give any lessons. So that she couldn't get lessons. So I'd taken her down a blue run that was much more like a red run because of the conditions, just with the ice and the snow. And we had a disagreement halfway down because she entered her panic zone. She was in her panic zone. It was icy. She didn't have the confidence or the ability to deal with the conditions. And she was like, I can't go any further. I'm going to sit down here. And I'm like, well, you can't. Like, you can't sit on the edge of the slope. It's quite a narrow slope as well. So we were in the way. But actually, and there were lots of other people in this situation as well, by the way. It wasn't just her. I think the slope was definitely misgraded.
Right.
Given the conditions, probably not misgraded if it was snow, but because it was ice, because the sun had been beaten on it for 3 days, and then it had frozen and the temperature had dropped and there hadn't been any fresh snow, it was icy. And it was icy, it was proper icy. She is in her panic zone. She cannot deal with the situation as it is presented. She is becoming irrational. She's sitting down. Like, I'm like, you can't sit. You've got to get off the bloody mountain. Like, you can't. We cannot come down this route again. That's fine. But I cannot take. You cannot get. You're not going to get on my back. And I've skied with someone on my back before to get them off a mountain. You know, like, you cannot get off of this mountain if you sit down.
Yeah.
That is your panic zone. That is the best way I can describe the panic zone.
And I think that was my realization that I didn't have a choice. I had to get myself out of that situation to safety. Yeah, brilliant example.
So when I think about that and make it relevant, not just to paddling and your example, but if you think about coaching, if we think about all the stuff we've discussed about the valley of despair and being under pressure, which is a whole other conversation that we can have, not today, and leadership and all of that sort of stuff. When I just summarize what we've talked about, I think for me the key is that if you're with someone and you're in their stretch zone, you have to be able to recognize that so you don't enter that panic zone. You know, if I'm out with someone doing an activity, I'm constantly watching that for that. That's why when we went mountain biking and I took you down to that crazy place with all the crazy trails, which was great fun for me.
A lovely walk.
It was a lovely walk for you, as you've described it. I kept checking in with you to make sure, but you were happy because, and I know you're happy because I've got confidence in you to just get off your bike and walk. But that's fine.
Yeah.
You're not in your panic zone because you're not doing it.
No, no.
But there are people out there who would have pushed into that because they would have tried and they'd have pushed themselves too far, and then all of a sudden that's when injuries are happening. That's when you start to get a mess, and that's where things start to occur and go wrong, isn't it?
Yeah. I've done a lot of biking though, so yeah. I guess it comes, it's about knowing your limits as well.
And that's another element of risk, isn't it?
Yeah, which we haven't even touched
on. This could be a 5-parter. Let's see. Should we call it a day there though for this episode?
Yes,
Do you think we've summed up enough of the conversation? I'm not going to go and start editing this. It's going to be all over the shop.
Leave it to the magic beast in your computer.
But it doesn't know what we're talking about. The magic beast can cut the cameras and make it look good. But the magic beast can't go, oh, that's a really interesting point. Let's put that in. Oh, Alex is talking waffling crap. Let's take that out.
You need to find a magic beast that does that then.
I'm sure there is one. I just don't want to pay for it. Thank you very much for listening to our chat today. If you have enjoyed this, is been a really in-depth conversation. I'd like to come back to some of this. Do leave us a comment. Let us know your thoughts. Can you recognize when you're in that stretch zone? Have you been in that panic zone when you've been out on the water?
Yeah.
What do you think about the chat that we've had? And we'll be live very, very soon. I mean, I've said that in the last 2 episodes as well. Like I keep being like, we're going to catch up and we're going to get live. This probably is the last one that we're pre-recording. My night shifts have definitely kind of messed up the plan. But thank you very much for watching. Leave us a comment, give it a like and subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, make sure you give it a follow. And thank you very much for being involved.
You are so much more used to doing this than I am. Yeah. Leave us examples of your stories where you've been stretched.
Absolutely.
If you wish. And thank you.